Welcome to another holiday conversation in this beautiful cafe in Sydney. We've got a lot of different conversations we've got planned in this cafe, and I can't wait to share them all with you. This week we've got an amazing conversation with Chavura, and once again we'll be delving into some of the things that have been happening the last 2 years, but also where we're going into the future. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me, Joel.
Can you please tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Yeah, sure. Well, currently I'm a senior lecturer in history at Campion College, which is a liberal arts college in Sydney, in Old Toongabbie. It's a great job, a fantastic place to work. The kids are great. My research areas over the years have sort of ranged from early modern history to modern Australian history, also political philosophy, history of political thought, that kind of thing. Obviously the last 2 years in terms of what's been going on, not just in Australia but also internationally, have been of huge interest to me as we've all been sort of watching things unfold and trying to figure out what's going on. And I tend to think of things as much as I can from a historical point of view, and also ask questions like, what does this mean for the nature of our democracy, the future of democracy, and those kinds of things, which is how I've sort of been approaching things. I suppose lately I've been trying to make very short videos for people to be able to articulate feelings that they might have that they might not quite have the words to be able to articulate. So that's been a new thing for me, sort of getting onto TikTok and Instagram and trying to sort of share a few little ideas, but it's been good.
So our first conversation we had, it was about a month ago. People loved it. It was, as I explained on the video, Dr. Chavura is phenomenal in his knowledge of politics. It was one of the very first people I started talking to on Australian politics going back to 2018, because I'd looked at American, I'd looked at the UK, and I was like, okay, that's fine. What about Australia? And so you were one of my first guides here, and I think at the time you were writing a history on one of the former prime ministers, or it was John Howard?
Yeah, probably. Yeah, I was co-writing a book on Robert Menzies at the time, and in fact, I may even have been writing 2 books because I've co-authored and published 2 in the last 2 years now, one on the history of the secular state in Australia, and then most recently this year a book on Robert Menzies. So you've got a good memory. I was writing something on an Australian Prime Minister.
Yeah, well I remember you had to duck off from the Australian Conservatives conference where you'd given a speech.
Did I? Yeah.
And you were saying, I gotta finish this book.
Probably, yeah. I must have had a deadline,
always working hard, Stephen, always working hard.
Oh, always, yeah, that's right. I wouldn't know what I'd do if I wasn't working, which can be good, but it can be bad.
Yeah, it's been a wild 2 years, and I think from some of your commentary you really alluded to the idea that it's underlying problems we're seeing in society. The collapse of Christianity, the rise of secularism in Australia, and we've been slowly seeing a lot of the census data come out and seeing that the dwindling numbers of people identifying as Christian. And also splitting all of us Christians into different segments as well.
Yeah, I think the splitting Christians into different segments, I think that's something that's probably going to diminish over time. I think Christians are actually being pushed together a lot more because as sort of the broader mainstream culture becomes more post-Christian, I would actually describe it as becoming more pagan. I think in some ways culture in the West, it's not becoming so much as what we might say secular, that is sort of without religion. I think in some ways what it's doing is it's retreating to a kind of paganism, a little bit like the paganism out of which Christianity sort of emerged historically. Christianity emerges out of Judaism, but what I mean is increasingly people are arguably turning from the worship of God to the worship of creation, to the worship of the environment. Also to the worship of their own bodies. Forms of Eastern mysticism and Eastern paganism becoming increasingly popular. But I think then there's also just a whole bunch of new rights movements, particularly LGBT rights that have emerged especially strongly in the last 20 years, which again are increasingly seeing Christianity not even as something to be tolerated, but something now to be contained and even punished, which is sort of what's going to wind up happening with some of these laws that are emerging in Victoria. And so what that's done is it's actually pushed Christians together. We're sort of forgetting about our historical sectarian differences. You're Catholic, I'm Protestant, you're Orthodox, I'm Catholic, and we're sort of forgetting about all of those, and we're seeing our identity increasingly as servants of Christ, which is as it should be, in my opinion. So I think that's one thing that is changing, and I think that is positive. But yeah, overall, yeah, I'm very interested in the question of, like, just for the COVID thing, if we could just mention that, like, why did what I would consider to be an element of hysteria about COVID, why did that happen? And I think similar things can be said about climate change. And probably even, in America at least, the Black Lives Matter movement, why did these sort of massive crowd dynamic movements, why did they happen? And for me, the question is, what human need does climate change, what does it fulfill that isn't being fulfilled right now by anything else?
Yeah.
And so that's kind of one of the questions I like to ask.
One of the questions I used to ask early on in the pandemic was why is it all it's the atheists that are screaming the loudest about COVID? Is it because that they're about it's the fear of death, it's the not having an eternal life plan sort of thing? I say it in jest, but I'm serious. I mean, if you're 80 years old, maybe you do want everyone jabbed below the age of 5, anything to just protect yourself out of fear.
I think that's actually a really good question. And one thing I've always wondered over the years is historically, around most of the world, and we'll restrict ourselves to sort of the Christian part of the world, which of course is both East and West, people have had a strong belief in an afterlife. And the overwhelming majority of people who would have called them Christians would have believed that this life is not all that there is. This isn't just the one shot that they've got, but this is a very, very fleeting part of our existence, and the next part will be infinitely better and it'll go on for eternity. Yeah. You've got to ask yourself what impact that might have had on the way people live, because that's a pretty huge belief to have. Like, that's not nothing. That's not, my favorite ice cream cup flavor is chocolate, which doesn't really have much of an impact on any other aspect of your life. Like, that impacts on just how you see existence. And you've got to ask yourself, did that, for example, have an impact on people's ability to accept things like illness and to accept things like death? And if it did, if historically it did, then it follows that with the decline of that belief in an afterlife, that decline must also have an impact on the way people think about existence themselves, and also the extent to which they are prepared to endure sickness and the extent to which they're prepared to accept the reality of death. Because if you believe that this life is all you have, then you are going, at least this is purely speculative and theoretical, but surely you would have a less tolerance of illness and of death, because in a sense you're robbed of everything. Yeah. Like, you've basically been born to suffer and that's it. Yeah. Whereas with the traditional Christian idea, it's, well, this life is going to be one of suffering, and you do have death, but that's just half the story. Yeah. And so I can't help but think that the decline of afterlife belief, or the decline of that particular aspect of Christianity, might actually be feeding into modern culture's intolerance of illness and death. Yeah. Which is not to say people should not care. Yeah. But I suppose the historian in me sort of asks, well, if belief in heaven at one point made a difference, then surely the absence of belief must make a difference as well. Yeah. And here we are now shutting down whole societies, forcing people to take vaccines they want, pulling kids out of school from which they may never actually recover, for a virus that, for those under the age of 50 has something like a 0.04% death rate, and overall has a 2% death rate. Like, it just, there's more going on here,
Yeah. Do you think that often people make the comparison to communist China, and they don't, the state does, it's the old trope, the state doesn't want people to be worshipping something above the state, because then they'll be loyal to that. They want people to be loyal to the state. Hence the cultural revolution that we saw in China. 20 to 50 million people dead. And of course they're cracking down on Christians. We don't know how many Christians are in China. Yeah. Do you think that we've seen a lot of government overreach in Australia in the last couple of years. Do you think that people are getting very cultish in their answers in trying to solve? I mean, a lot of people, they want to burn the government down, they want to do this, they want to do that. We're seeing cult figures rise up, and everyone wants their saviour. I mean, how do we navigate all of this, especially the average Australians who didn't tune into politics? I mean, it's the Wild West right now.
It seems like the Wild West, and you talk about sort of cult figures rising up. I prefer to call them sort of folk heroes. So like when we go to these protests, and you and I have been to a lot of these rallies, and you see some of these very, very famous social media people come along who've basically become famous Australians without any help from the mainstream media. And I basically see them as sort of folk heroes. And dare I say it, Joel, you've sort of become a bit of a folk hero, because when I've seen you at these protests, people just see you and they flock to you and they thank you. And that's definitely something we're dealing with. But one thing that I have to say I have found a bit disturbing is that there are increasingly calls to try to fix all of this almost with an element of violence to it. That we need, I mean, I've heard people say that we need to sort of overthrow the government, we need to hang everyone who's betrayed Australia. And I suppose my issue with that is, revolutions historically have to have certain preconditions to really work. And the strongest precondition for a revolution that actually happens is hunger. That people actually have to be hungry. People have to be so desperate for something that they will actually overthrow a regime. And that historically is often the case with revolution. We don't have anything like that in Australia. Australia is one of the most prosperous countries in the world. We have some of the most obese people in the world here in Australia. But secondly, again, this sort of bravado that some people come up with, the kinds of people who the best idea they can come up with is basically to overthrow the system and hang everyone that they consider to be the traitors. These are not necessarily the kinds of people that you want in charge of a revolution or running a country. These are not necessarily creative thinkers. So I totally get their frustration, but that is one aspect of sort of what you might call the anti-COVID cult movement that does kind of worry me. And I guess what I'm saying is the fact of the matter is we have these institutional structures around us. We live in what is supposed to be a liberal democracy. We've got these two major parties, Liberal and Labor. We've got minor parties coming in. I think that realistically, if we're going to talk about solving problems or improving things, it has to be through the system that we already have, as sort of cracked and broken as it is, which is why we talk about new parties starting up, freedom parties, and so we sort of work within the system. But I think for the most part, those who advocate sort of more extreme measures, I think they're for the most part in the minority. But they are sort of becoming increasingly vocal, and I can understand it, because these people are losing their jobs, and now authorities are talking about vaccinating kids. That's pretty serious stuff, so I can sort of understand why some of that rhetoric's emerging. But I personally, it doesn't impress me. I think there's a lot of bravado, and I think it's born of serious frustration, and I can understand it, but I don't see it as a way forward, realistically. Historically, revolutions either fail because they don't have the level of popular support that they need, or they succeed disastrously. So Russia, China. I mean, there have been a handful of revolutions which have been really positive. The English Revolution, the American Revolution. The French Revolution at first was a disaster, and it sort of limped on, and it really took nearly 80 years for the French Revolution to sort of work itself out. So it's a really dangerous path to tread, and historically it's not the one that you want to try.
So more often than not, the violent revolution would fail?
Revolutions rarely work, and violent revolutions will either just fail because they don't have the level of popular support, or they don't have the level of expertise among the revolutionaries to be able to not just pull off a revolution, but run a country. It's hard to run a country.
It is, yeah.
But secondly, those that succeed, the term I use is they tend to succeed disastrously in that, they overthrow an old system, but they generally impose a much worse one.
Yeah, I guess the lesson also would be historically, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're the historian, Hitler did fail the first time, didn't he? And then he went into jail and wrote Mein Kampf and he did get the popular support.
Yeah, he did.
And then when he came out, he bided his time, ran on his military record, built his army of 2 million stormtroopers, as we like to allude to in the Star Wars series.
Yes.
and then he was in a very good position to have the one-party rule. But a couple of things there. You said one of the indicators, one of the preconditions is food, the food shortage. Tim Pool made you love Tim Pool.
I love Tim Pool, and my wife loves him even more. She even bought him a beanie and sent it to him. She did. We were shopping around for hours and hours, going all over Sydney to find the right beanie for him.
You're kidding me?
No joke.
I want his beanie. I don't know where he gets it from, but I want him to make them and send them out. I would wear it in winter. But he made some great points about violent revolutions, he said the food was one of them. I think he used the example of Libya. I think it was Libya.
Okay.
And he gave the story about there being certain preconditions, one being food. He said that 38% of a household's costs had to go to food before it was sort of a violent revolution was in a good spot. Very specific. Someone, I can't remember who did the analysis.
Political scientists literally will do all this analysis. They do it,
It's amazing. And I'm like, okay, look, we could actually end up in a situation where things are like that. The way inflation's going in America, we're seeing shortages happen there. You know, a cafe like this over there might be like, no, we don't serve chicken anymore. We just don't have, the truckers, or, what are they calling it? The Great Resignation, which is all of these people resigning.
Yes.
And, I think that's why there's a big push for immigration to sort of fill the gap.
No doubt.
Fill the gap in teachers, nurses, surgeons.
No, there's no doubt.
So that was the first thing I thought, because what happened in Libya, and I might get this completely wrong. It might have been another country. But whichever country it was, those conditions were there, including the food. 38% of household costs were going towards food, just feeding a family. And then there was just an incident in front of the palace there. There was this guy that everyone knew in the community, old man, just trying to sell his fruit. And then was that Libya?
Is it Yemen?
It might have been Yemen.
This is the beginning of the Spring Rebellion, or this is back in. Was this the Arab Spring? He's talking about the Arab Spring.
Was it?
Boy, it's been a long time. But the fruiterer. I think he was in Yemen. He set himself on fire. Is this correct?
Because he couldn't sell his fruit because the guards basically said you can't sell your fruit, and everyone knew this guy. And then that was the trigger that started the revolution and the Arab Spring. I mean, it's almost like the shot going off that started World War I. Shot that went around the world.
That's exactly right.
But the preconditions were there. That's interesting. That's it. But the other thing, you're making the point of, we can't reverse 50 to 100 years worth of filth or change by doing 3 years worth of work. I'm sorry, guys. Easy come, easy go. And when it comes to what's going on in this country, I think we're in for the long haul, and that's easy for me to say as a 24-year-old. But I think we're in for the long haul. There's a lot of re-education that has to happen. Universities have to be, the long march through the institutions has to be done by us. We've got to undo all of that. But how do we do that, Stephen? How do we go about doing that?
I mean, that is the hardest question to answer, but I actually do think it's important. I think your point that this is going to take a long time, we're in for the long haul, I actually think that is absolutely key, because a lot of people, when they ask, how do we do this, what they really mean is, how can we, in maybe 1 year or 2 years or 3 years, just fix everything? And you can't. It's like you said, that problems tend to arise very slowly over time. And it was the great sort of Florentine political thinker Machiavelli who said, this is a paraphrase of Machiavelli, and it's one of my favorite quotes of all time, but basically what he said was, by the time you notice that there exists a very, very complicated problem in society, by the time you notice it, it's too late to fix it.
Wow.
Like, it's taken too long to emerge, and it emerges, you don't see it coming, but by the time you see it, it's too late. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's too late to fix it forever. It just means that right now it's become so difficult that you can address it, but it's going to take a lot of time. And the other thing is, I don't believe in solutions. That is, in any society that we're living in, where there are always going to be problems in our democracy, there are always going to be problems in our economy, there are always going to be problems in our families. And you're never going to solve everything, because we're living in a fallen world. We're living in a world tainted by sin. And what that often means is one solution will lead to problems elsewhere, but it doesn't mean that you can't make certain things better. And so the question, I guess this is me rephrasing the question, how do we fix things, or what do we do? How can we make things better over time? Well, again, I think a lot of the things that you've been doing are incredibly important. I think actually drawing people's attention to the fact that there are alternative parties than the two major parties, and also to try to address a legendary complacency amongst Australians about Australia. I mean, I've said this before, that in 1964, Donald Horne wrote a very famous book called The Lucky Country, and we all and that book, the title sort of has come into our vernacular. Oh, we're the lucky country, and we brag about that. But actually, Donald Horne was criticising Australia. He wasn't saying that. He was basically saying that one of the reasons Australia is so successful is because we're lucky. It's not that necessarily that Australians particularly care about the health of their institutions. And I definitely think that certainly since the 1990s, Australia has had incredible prosperity. We've had incredible economic growth. We've sailed through the GFC back in, was it 2008? We've done so well. And I think, quite frankly, we've become very inward looking, we've become very complacent, we just think that everything will be okay. We've just been digging coal out and selling it to China to maintain our lifestyle. And I think we're at the point now where, in actual fact, we have to start taking an interest in what our politicians are doing and the laws that they're passing, but also taking an interest in what's become of the Australian character. And I'm just not convinced that enough Australians care about what government is doing, that they care about their own liberties. I know that a lot do, but I really see us as a country of very, very complacent citizens who have allowed governments to lock them in their houses for the best part of, in some instances, 2 whole years, pull their kids out of school, so literally denying their children educations, with barely a whimper of protest. So certainly just Australians becoming aware of how apathetic we've become. I think one of the good things is that we have this thing called social media, where we can actually bypass the mainstream media and get the messages out there. And I think that the freedom marches all around Australia are a really hopeful sign that, in actual fact, we can mobilise numbers. One other thing I'll say, and this actually breaks my heart to say this, because I wrote a biography. I co-wrote an intellectual biography of the great founder of the Liberal Party, Robert Menzies, a man that I really admire. But it may be the case, frankly, that major parties, and maybe particularly the Liberal Party, and this will get me in trouble with people I know, but it's the way it is, that Liberal Party since 1996 has only been out of power, I think, for about 6 years. They're used to getting elected, like federally, and in New South Wales. They're basically used to getting elected. And they're basically counting on Conservatives who are still disgruntled with the way the Liberal Party is. They're basically counting on them saying, well, of course I'm going to vote Liberal because Labor's going to be worse. And I think it's probably time for a lot of historic Liberal voters to actually just say, no, in fact, I'm not going to vote. I'm not going to reward the Liberal Party with a vote when they've basically not spoken out about mandates, but they've been very weak on issues like religious freedom of late. When they, basically capitulated to these comprehensive lockdowns, and I think, I'm historically a fan of the Liberal Party. I've voted for them many times.
Yeah, me too.
And I want to see them reformed. But sometimes the best way to reform a party is not to reward them for doing the right thing.
And let it collapse, right?
Well, if not let it collapse, let them experience a term or two in the wilderness, so just the party hacks will realise there's not much power or prestige to be had. We're in opposition, they'll leave, and the really principled conservative members of the Liberal Party can come in and start rebuilding it. And it's, in a sense, maybe it needs to be humbled, maybe it needs to be chastened, and it's not going to be humbled and chastened if it just keeps getting re-elected. And so that kind of breaks my heart, but that might be an actual, a major step forward in reforming Australia. Now, a lot of people say, oh, both the major parties, they suck, forget about them. No, I'm sorry, in actual fact, they're here to stay. Like, it is just part of the political scaffolding that we are in, and the Liberal Party isn't going anywhere, the Labor Party isn't going anywhere, and so to me, there is an imperative to reform these parties, but that means that part of that may actually be for the next elections actually voting for minor parties, and those who are not going to give their votes to any major parties. So that might be that's sort of part of the long-term future, because I want to see the Liberal Party go back to its liberal roots. And the truly Liberal Party never would have overseen the lockdown of a whole country for as long as we locked down, and it most certainly would never have connived at the kind of vax mandates that we've been putting up with here in Australia for the last 6 months. No Liberal Party worth its salt would have connived at that.
I have to ask, we've been seeing what's been going on the last few weeks. Scott Morrison's been trying to play some damage control and been trying to rekindle his vote with the base, basically. He knows he needs to recapture the right wing of his own party. Do you believe him when he says, we don't have mandatory vaccines in this country, we need to adopt personal responsibility? Basically, he's trying to be like, oh yeah, I was always for freedom of choice and speech and everything.
I don't believe him for a second, not for 1 second. He was happy to see these mandates ruin many people's lives who lost their jobs, many of whom had probably good reasons not to want to be vaccinated. We have to remember that there are over 10,000 vax injury legal claims being lodged against governments here in Australia right now. You've got well over 80,000 registered vaccine adverse events. They're just the registered ones, so goodness knows. Look, you know something, man, I was having dinner with some friends last night, and there was a youngster there. He was about 18, 19. I think he had his second Pfizer. This guy's healthy as a horse. And he even said that after he had his second shot, he felt sort of heart palpitations. Now, he never reported or anything, and he sort of wrote it off, and he seems to be okay now. But when you go into an emergency room at a hospital, one of the first things you read on their signs is, if you are experiencing your heart palpitations, go straight to the front, because that's. And how many people are experiencing these things? And these vaccines are mandatory now. In all honesty, and again, some of my followers won't like me saying this, but if you're over 70, and you maybe you're not particularly healthy, I would actually advise you to think seriously about getting a vaccination, because if you catch COVID, that could be deadly for you.
Absolutely.
But the overwhelming majority of people it's not deadly for, but we've gone over this before, but do I believe ScoMo? No, I don't, and I think it's inexcusable that for months and months he watched these mandates be put in place and said absolutely nothing about it. And I'm going to say he gaslighted the Australian public by saying that no one is being forced. We're not forcing anyone to take a vaccination. Well, I'm sorry, but threatening people with their jobs, their ability to pay their mortgages, pay their rent, feed their families, and threatening to take away everything they've worked for in their career unless you take a vaccine. That is pretty close to coercion. Well, let me put it this way. Let's say in Australia a new rule emerged that all workplaces impose that if you want to keep your job, you have to either become a Christian or convert, or you have to convert to Christianity. Would it make sense for someone saying, oh, no one's being forced to convert to Christianity, we still have religious freedom in Australia? Like, no one would believe that for a second.
Not for a second.
And nor should they believe it about these vaccines.
Right.
And for me, there was a really low moment I actually thought for ScoMo. And I voted for ScoMo. I was so happy when he was elected.
Yeah, me too.
Well, it was a great night. I remember it very well. But the other day when someone was talking about George Christensen went on to, was it Alex Jones' show?
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
so he goes on to Alex Jones' show. Okay,
Yeah.
sure, you know.
Yeah.
And the interviewer says to Scott Morrison, hey, he went on Alex Jones' show. What does it take for someone to be kicked out of the Liberal Party? And I thought to myself, well, let's see what ScoMo says about this. And the answer that ScoMo should have given was, well, in actual fact, in the Liberal Party, we do actually believe in freedom of speech. And if you can point to something that George Christensen has said that has been incendiary or there's been obscene or something like that, that is him expressing his opinion, and it's the opinion of lots of Australians. And in the Liberal Party, we have a diversity of views. We're not the Labor Party, we're the Liberal Party.
That's right.
And that's something that we welcome in this party. No, that's not what he said. He basically just said, you know, well, I think George needs to go quietly into the night. You know,
Yeah,
and I just
he
thought,
said go quietly into retirement.
go quietly into, and I just thought to myself, that is not a Liberal leader right there.
No.
That is a leader who's more afraid of the media
Yeah.
than anything, really.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I'm deeply disappointed in how Scott Morrison has conducted himself. And you know, I think people need to think very, very carefully about rewarding the Liberal Party for the way it's behaved. And you know, people will say, oh, but the Labor Party will be much worse. Well, will it? Will it?
I don't know.
I mean, the Liberal Party is dragging its feet on issues like religious liberty. It's done very little to stop these mandates and the lockdowns.
Yeah.
Let's say Labor turned out to be a bit worse. Well, maybe in the long run, having a reformed and better Liberal Party in the long run, that's a better strategy.
Yeah, the marshmallow strategy, deferred, you know, the marshmallow experiment they do with kids, deferred
deferred gratification.
Gratification.
Yeah.
So, Stephen, you're not a Dr. Stephen Chavura I'm sitting with. This is not a ranting, raving person. This is someone who co-wrote a book, basically historically laying out the legacy of Menzies. And here he is saying that basically Scott Morrison is going against all of the
Yes.
values that are on the Liberal Party's own website.
Absolutely. There's no doubt in my mind about that.
To be liberal means to be free, to be promoting certain values. What are those values?
Well, to be a liberal means that you have a particular view of the people over whom you govern. So in the olden days, people were seen basically as subjects.
Right.
They were not seen as sort of autonomous individuals. They were basically seen as matter that needed to be governed.
Serfs.
Serfdom. They were
Right.
subjects. In a liberal democracy, we're supposed to see them as citizens. You're supposed to see citizens as autonomous, equal agents who are capable of making their own decisions in their own lives, whether that's about where they work, what they do, economic decisions, their life plans and things like that. And of course, you know, you can't just do anything you want, but basically the liberal vision of people is that they are autonomous agents. And I'm pretty sympathetic with that vision. I would call myself a conservative liberal or a liberal conservative. Some people would say that doesn't make sense. I think it does make sense. And so any Liberal Party that either imposes mandates or, and this is how they get out of it, they'll say, oh, we didn't impose it, you know, businesses impose them, or oversees and connives and allows them to be imposed by businesses, is basically allowing citizens to be treated like children, or to be treated like they're not rational agents with the ability to make their own decisions. And so Scott Morrison's silence over people, thousands of people losing their jobs, his compliance with states locking citizens down for 3-4 months. You know, obviously, you know, Victorians locked down for 200 days all up. And this is also happening under Liberal governments here in New South Wales. That is a total betrayal of the principles of liberalism. A total betrayal of it. It's totally inexcusable. And you know, you're not going to see the Liberal Party reformed if you reward it for overseeing that with a vote.
Right.
And again, it breaks my heart for saying it. It'll probably mean there are certain things I will no longer get invited to.
Right.
But that's okay, because I do actually have the interests of the Liberal Party at heart. I want to see them actually reformed and improved, because right now I'm just deeply disappointed in what's been taking place. But yes, there's just nothing liberal about what ScoMo has done.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's been a big litany of people leave the Liberal Party. I mean, I've never been a member of the Liberal Party, but I did vote for Scott Morrison in the last election.
Yeah.
But since the last election in May 2019, who have we seen resign? We've seen John Ruddick. He's running for the New South Wales Liberal Democrats, the Libertarians. He wrote the book Make the Liberal Party Great Again. And he had some phenomenal ideas in there, like having primaries, making it more democratic, really reforming the inner workings of it to give the power back to the membership, rather than this nameless, faceless people you never meet. And he's gone. He says, no, you know what, we can't reform it, it's too late, we can't do it. We've got former parliamentarian Dougal Cameron's father, Ross Cameron. He was the member for Parramatta. The man would have been Prime Minister, they like to say. It was before my time. And he also left. He's also jumped to the Liberal Democrats.
That's right.
This week this week we saw Deputy Mayor John Larter. He hasn't resigned from the Liberal Party. They haven't kicked him out yet. They will soon, I have no doubt. He's leaving. He's gone to the Liberal Democrats. He'll probably run with them, and more power to him. By the way, guys, Liberal Democrats, they're libertarians. They're the people that want their guns back. They have no affiliation with the Liberal Party. And then you've also got former Premier Campbell Newman of Queensland, and he's got a mixed record with the people of Queensland. But the guy, he's also left the Liberal Party, gone to the Liberal Democrats. Now, this isn't a commercial for the Liberal Democrats. I have no relationship with them. But there's something wrong with the Liberal Party. They've left their values, and they're going to they've moved to the left. And even I know that if they spend a bit of time out of government, they will never win government back from the left. They will only win it back from the Conservative side, which means there'll have to be a lot of reform that happens. I'm here for it. I'd love to see that happen. Nothing would make me happier to hear someone be the Liberal Party actually do their job. That way we could all go back to our old lives and do things properly. But I think we're in for the long haul, and I think these minor parties are playing a very important role in reforming the system. Absolutely,
and I would just also say there are still very good people in the Liberal Party. I'm not going to go through and name them all, but there are very good people in the Liberal Party, but not enough. Not enough. So I'm quite excited about some of these individuals and some of these minor parties that have emerged who are really going to try and really, scare the Liberals straight, in a sense, and hopefully we'll see some of these people get elected and make some trouble in upper houses of parliaments.
Fingers crossed. Now's time for my brutally honest revelation. I've been looking at the electorates around the country, and I can't see one electorate out of all 151 seats in the House, the lower house, that's where the Prime Minister is, where we're going to get up. I just can't. I can't see it. Maybe we'll get up. We'll get because we've got One Nation in Queensland. They've got one of their senators up for re-election. I think it's Malcolm Roberts, not Pauline. Malcolm Roberts is up for re-election. I think they'll get them back, but they'll be competing with the Liberal Democrats and others. So we'll have one in Queensland, maybe one in New South Wales, maybe. Maybe Craig Kelly will run in New South Wales, and maybe one in Victoria. Big maybe. Maybe the Liberal Democrats will get up. But it looks like the balance of power is going to have to be captured in the Senate, not the House. Because you need 50. You need 50% with preferences. Unless someone does like a deal with the major parties and sells their soul, I don't know.
Oh, there's no doubt. If there's going to be any impact, it'll be in the upper houses, not in the lower houses. In a sense that look, the big question really is, do enough Australians care? And I think a lot of Australians care. The question is, do enough care? I mean, it'd be nice to think that most Australians still care about what their governments do to them. That most Australians still have an interest in ensuring that governments don't fall into a mentality whereby they think they can basically do whatever they want to us. And as long as we've got money coming in, as long as we've got Netflix, as long as we've got beer in the fridge, we're happy. It'd be nice to think that that's not the reality, but we don't know that yet. it may, I mean, I don't want to sort of rain on the parade or anything, but it may actually be the case that that not enough Australians care enough. I don't know yet, and it'll probably take more than one election, you know.
Definitely, I think so, yeah.
Even if things don't go so well at the next federal and state elections, it doesn't mean all hope is lost. That might actually be the shake-up that a lot of people need. And again, it keeps coming back to your point, Joel, that this is a long-term project. Like, this sort of rot, whether it's inordinate influence of China, inordinate influence of corporations in politics, just sort of all sorts of hard and soft corruption in politics. This isn't something that's just emerged quickly. This is something that's been emerging for 20, 30 years, and it's going to take time to really resolve. And I think also, to get back to sort of something we were saying earlier, I think COVID has actually revealed a kind of spiritual void among Australians. And one thing I noticed actually early on with COVID, with the lockdowns, sort of watching people's behaviour on Facebook, a lot of people were just having the time of their life. I think a lot of people just found COVID, the lockdowns, incredibly exciting, and they loved it. And I think for a lot of people, so here we are in Australia, nationalism might be on the wane. We're not a very religious country anymore, which isn't to say we're secular, but we're just not as religious as, say, the Americans are. We're probably more religious than some European countries, but religion doesn't bind us together. It's not necessarily religion that gives the average Australian a sense of meaning. At the community level, do strong communities exist much more in Australia, or have become very individualistic? I'm not sure that. We don't seem to have a sort of a strong sense of national pride in the country. We tend to be cynical about people who are very, very nationalistic. We say, oh, they're trying to copy the Americans and things like that. And so sort of COVID comes along, and I think in some ways what we haven't derived from religion in generations, what we haven't derived maybe from nationalism in a little while, and from local communities which arguably are sort of dying as elsewhere around the West, COVID kind of made people feel like we're doing something together, and they probably haven't felt that literally maybe in their whole lives, that we're doing something together. We're fighting a common enemy. I mean, when was the last time Australia had a sort of an existential threat of a war? I mean, not even the Iraq wars were anything like that. Maybe World War I, maybe World War II. World War II, I suppose, for sure. But the point is that I think the way we've reacted to COVID, the way politicians have exploited that, really shows a spiritual void in Australia that can be filled by good things, or it could be filled by things that are actually quite dangerous. And I think filling it with things like a fear of an inordinate fear of COVID has proven to be actually quite detrimental. I don't know how to fix that though.
Well, I think an element of that is the COVID's been interesting, hasn't it? I mean, it has been revealing a lot of the inadequacies we've been having in society and how we connect with each other. But how do we fix it? That's a great question. But I did want to just point out, if you want a good metric, and you'll find this very useful in future conversations, if you wanted a metric of how far we've fallen in terms of the importance of churches and versus now. When we did the petition we said we want the jab rollout to abide by the Nuremberg Code. It was the third or fourth biggest e-petition in Australian history. We got 309,000 signatures. It was amazing. The biggest e-petition was 500,000. I think it was on climate change. But if you look at the paper petitions, it's in the millions, the records. And I was like, hang on, this is before the internet. How did they get millions of these signatures? And I was like, well, of course, it was the churches. And people were more inviting of people when they knocked on the door as well. Now, if someone knocks on the door, you think it's the police. It's like, we're not used to...
Speak for yourself.
Well, I mean...
Actually, they visited me 4 times.
Oh, did they?
Oh, yeah.
You poor thing.
I know them by name.
Oh, you did? Oh, God. Yeah, you know what's bad when you start recognizing them. That's when you're becoming familiar. Isn't that right, Mario? But no, it's like back then you used to have unannounced guests a lot more at your house, whereas nowadays it's like, why didn't you put it in the Google calendar. You know, we book a time.
You know, you bring up an interesting point. During the Federation period, leading up to Federation in, let's say, you know, when it's officially celebrated in 1901, 1st of January, leading throughout the 1890s, the single biggest petitions that were presented to the Constitution conventions were petitions to have God acknowledged in the preamble.
Wow.
So of all the issues that they got people petitioning on, all sorts of issues, that by far the biggest number of signatures was to make sure that God was not left out of the Constitution, and ultimately it succeeded. And it didn't succeed because the Constitution, the people writing the Constitutions wanted it. They actually didn't want it that much, not because they were anti-religious. They just thought it kind of overcomplicates things. It's too controversial. But it kind of got to the point where they were really worried that the people would not vote in favour of Federation unless God was in it, because the petitions just kept coming in their thousands. And I've read the minutes, and it gets to a point where people start saying, look, you know something, we can't ignore these people because they're not going away. And they had two referenda to federate. The first one failed. And they had to do it again. They didn't want to fail a second time, and so they put God in the preamble. And many historians nowadays say that that was very, very important for actually. So the point, I'm sort of agreeing with your point, Joel, that the churches historically have been incredible agents of civic mobilization. And I mean, I'm a great believer in what my good friend Martin Isles said on Facebook today, that what Australia really needs is a revival. It needs a Christian revival. It needs people to sort of think, you know something, my grandparents, whom I revere, the wonderful, stoic, hard-working, thoughtful, hard-fighting people. These are my heroes. A lot of Australians feel that way, and what we need to get them to see is that their grandparents almost certainly were Christians. It wasn't that there was more to their grandparents than the fact that they were hard-working, that they fought in wars, that they were frugal, that they were disciplined, they were stoical. There was more than that. They were Christians, and what we need is for Australians today to remember that part about their parents, and to re-explore that part of their heritage, because you know, Aussies are really into heritage. They're interested in, you know, who came out on the first fleet, who was a convict, who was in the gold fields, you know, who fought in World War I, and all of that is fantastic. But one thing they also need to understand, if they really want to understand their ancestors, is what did they believe about God? And in fact, their ancestors almost certainly believed in God and believed that Jesus was God, and that had a big impact on their lives. And that's something that they need to rediscover for themselves.
Have you heard of the fourth turning?
No.
It's really interesting. Tim Pool's talked about this. You have to.
Well, if Tim Pool's talked about it, I'm interested.
He's amazing. I'm going to botch this, but I'm going to do it as best a job I can. Essentially, the fourth turning it's something that happens every 80 years. So 80 years ago, what did we have? We had, let's use America as an example historically. 80 years ago, we had the First and Second World Wars. 80 years before that, they had the American Revolution. American Civil War rather. And then 80 years before that, they roughly had the Revolution of Independence. The War for Independence.
1776.
So it seems as though it was sort of an 80-year block. Now they call it the fourth. The fourth turning, because what happens is they say that after a big event like that, the first generation, the greatest generation, for example, there's this window of the generation where they're sort of like, you know, they're really empowered. They know who they are. They've got meaning out of the struggle that's come on from the Great Depression, the World Wars, fighting in them, the struggle that had happened. And then, you know, the second and third generation, you know, it slowly sort of starts to wane. And then by the time you get to the fourth generation, it's like you're ready for another event every 80 years. Well, that's where we are right now. And so the theorist, I forgot the name of the theorist who said this, I'm botching this, but the name of the theorist who said this, he basically said, well, we're due for one right now where we sort of are reminded of what's important to us and what our values are. So we're sort of at that inflection point.
I mean, I think that's very interesting. The one spanner I might throw in the works is that technology is so different now from what it was 80 years ago. That I think I think that is a serious variable that might sort of mean that what's meant to happen now maybe doesn't happen. I mean, technology is incredibly important for understanding what's going on. Why cultures do what they do, and the technology that we have now is just so different historically. These patterns might be thrown out a bit. And we have to remember that historically technology has changed more rapidly in the last sort of 50 years than any period in human history. It's just unbelievable, and that means that those sort of long-term projections of what we're due to have now doesn't mean they can be thrown out, but we need to be very careful about thinking that the same thing's going to happen now that what happened. But I'm sort of a fan of that view, and it is actually the case that when you have massive events, whether they're civil wars, whether they're world wars, whether they're pandemics, what does tend to happen, and there have been books written on this, is that people in politics, corporations tend to take advantage of these things to be able to restructure things to their own favour.
BMW.
Well, I mean, industrialization. I mean, corporations. The Ford, Ford manufacturing after World War I, and that is a common thing. The world after World War II was very different from the world before World War II. And so when you have sort of globe-stopping events like COVID, there are some things that never go back to normal. And there are people, and they'll do it with the best intentions, but who cares about people's intentions? Because good intentions are the road to hell anyway. So with this, I guess what I'm saying is that there's a strong possibility that with this COVID pandemic, that certain things will never be the same again. I don't know exactly what they will be. But what you sort of said about sort of the sort of you have a disaster or some important event, and that creates a great generation. That is absolutely historically true. And reading the ancient historians, even the ancient historians sort of complain. They sort of say the same things, like when Rome is at war, life is hard. Rome wins a war, life is easy. Like they've more incomes come in, they've got more slaves, and what that leads to is moral degeneration. That people become soft, they stop caring about the rest of society, they've got everything they need, and they just start indulging all their pleasures, and that makes society weak, it makes it immoral, which kind of over time makes it miserable as well.
It's the course of empire paintings of Rome.
Exactly. Well, it's sort of almost like the cycle of empires, and there's no doubt, in my opinion, that in the West we're going through a kind of degeneration. There's no doubt about it. We're becoming spiritually degenerate. I do think that we're becoming increasingly selfish and indifferent to our governing authorities. The question is, where is all this going to lead? And no historian knows the answer to that.
Well, I guess I think with the 80-year thing, I hear you on the technology thing. It's a real spanner in the works. But I think the reason why the 80 years before it was World War II, World War I, and then 80 years before that it was the American Civil War, and then 80 years before that it was the American War for Independence. I think generally it was like sort of you had four generations, 20 years, 20 years, 20 years, 20 years. And what that was, it was them passing on their knowledge, and it just slowly wanes over time. The struggle, and we sort of talk about the immigrants here, it's that immigrant struggle sort of thing. And that's why when we get them out here, I mean, more often than not, I'm seeing immigrants that are the ones starting up these channels, or I call them the wogs because I can say that.
My wife says that too.
Well, there you go. I feel like, and I didn't really work this out, that it was struggle in my journey of following politics until I started looking at Poland, and I was like, what happened in Poland? And correct me if I'm wrong, they first got invaded by the Nazis, or first cab off the rank, and then they got invaded by Russia. They really got it hard. They remember what happened. So no wonder they're the first to speak up when it comes to issues of massive migration from the Middle East, or whether it's issues with the EU, or with Chinese influence, or with big tech, because they have it hardwired into their bloodstream that, we struggled. This was a hard-won war. But in Australia, we've never fought a war here before. The worst we've had is the bombing of Darwin in the north. That was as bad as it got. Maybe a couple submarines in Sydney Harbour.
Yeah, the catapult, that's right, yeah.
But other than that, and that's where I think the memory thing comes in. It's about memory. So how do you fix that? I don't know, but whoever can answer the question of how do you put struggle and drive into our children for the future without doing torture, if you can answer that question, I think we can actually avoid doing this thing every 80 years and relearning the lessons of history. Because there's those great quotes, history rhymes but it never repeats.
Yeah.
And also history is just the same problems done by different people. I think that if you can answer that question, maybe, and I know, I'm 24, what would I know? But if you can answer that question, I feel like we could actually make some ongoing progress into the coming hundreds of years to come.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm only 43, so what do I know? 43 is, I mean, it's not very, very young, but it's not old.
Young, yeah.
But
Yeah.
I mean, some people say things along the lines of, you know, really the only hope of getting Australians to sort of feel united again and to care about how they are governed and to care about what we might call liberties is for there to be such an existential threat that it forces people to care, and that of course would be China.
Right.
And so, look, it's entirely possible that Australia just sort of limps on the way it's going. That's entirely possible. China doesn't do anything to us because it's too afraid that the US might intervene, and that's entirely possible. And I also don't want to suggest that I don't think Australia is a great country. I think Australia is an incredible country. I do think it's one of the best countries in the world, but it's not perfect. And so, yeah, the answer, you know, what might sort of wake Australians up from their complacent slumber, from just relying on luck to get us through everything, may actually be an actual assault from China. And this is the thing, historically, as you said, you know, we were attacked by Japan in 1942, and people were killed, and that really shocked us. Could it happen again? Well, why not? Like, why couldn't it? And that may be what Australians actually need to remember, that there are some things that actually are more important than just being able to go to the beach, watch Netflix, and you know, have enough money in the bank to be able to go drinking on a Friday night. That they're actually, there's a sort of there's a political scaffolding that's in place, and an economic scaffolding in place that actually allows us to live these great lives. And because it's not been seriously threatened in Australia for a very, very long time, we've kind of just taken it for granted. We don't even notice that it's there.
Yeah.
And that may be where we're at. But having said that, I don't want China to do anything bad to us. I really don't, because I don't want us to go to war, because war is hell. Yeah. And the only people who praise war, as the old saying goes, are those who've never been.
That's right. That's right.
But that may be, that could be where we're heading. I don't want it, but I definitely think that, you know, being the lucky country that has, I'll just say it, I think that's corrupted our character. And this is something that Menzies used to speak about. Politicians these days can't criticise the Australian public. They'll just be, they'll be turfed out. Can you imagine these days a politician sort of saying to the Australian public, you know, you guys are complacent, you guys don't care about your liberties, you know, come on guys, get your act together. Can you imagine? Menzies used to do it. Yeah. He used to, I've read his speeches.
Oh, he would,
he would do it. He would say, look, you know, Australians, you know, you're too complacent. Yeah. You're not thinking rationally. You know, you need to take a greater interest in what your government does. You need to take greater interest in. He would actually chastise Australia.
Wow. I feel like you definitely couldn't get away with it.
You couldn't get away with it these days.
But why? Obviously, you've got to speak to the people that you know. There's a time and place for it. But is it that we've lost our religious side? We don't have a common sort of angle. We don't hold ourselves under God or something. I think
you know, probably a lot of things. I mean, we've gone through over 40 years this sort of change in how you teach people, how you raise children. You don't criticize children anymore. You don't tell them that their work is bad. And so we're just not used to being criticized.
Right.
And this is something that pervades our whole culture. Just to disagree with someone for some people is almost like an assault on them.
A physical assault.
But to get back to Menzies, one of the things he used to say was Australians, the one thing that you're in great danger of is, Australia came out of World War II for the most part unscathed. Europe had to rebuild after World War II, and so it went through an economic decline for a period after World War II. Australia, straight after World War II, went on an economic boom. And Menzies' great warning was, be careful that your prosperity and that your technology doesn't stop you from being concerned about being a moral human being, about being a godly human being, and that you just become concerned about being a consuming and a pleasure-seeking human being. Right. And that's what Menzies said to Australia all the time, not just in the 40s, but in the 50s as well. He said, be careful that you don't lose your spirit.
Yeah.
And I think in some ways in Australia we've lost our spirit. Howard tried to regain it a bit by reviving Anzac. It'll be interesting to see how long the revival of Anzac in Australia continues, because I have a feeling it won't continue forever. And so I think Anzac in Australia for a good 20 years, from the mid-90s, really answered to a spiritual need that we had in Australia. Who are we? What are we as a nation? What should we as Australians see as greater than us? Because people need something to worship if they're not worshipping themselves. And Anzac really fulfilled that need. But if that declines, and it may decline as we fight fewer wars, so there are fewer veterans in the family, more immigrants come to Australia who just quite frankly don't identify with Anzac that much. If that declines, then what will take its place?
Right.
And the answer to that is, I don't know. I mean, with more immigrants don't come from secular countries, they come from very religious countries. So it may actually be the case that over the next 30 years, Australia becomes more religious.
I mean, I think there were 12 places around Australia that voted no on the same-sex marriage debate, 10 of which were in southwest and western Sydney.
Absolutely.
And they were also the same LGAs that the government locked down. Yeah. Like that.
Yeah, that's
like
right.
A hand.
And these are also the people, and when we go to these protests. I remember when I went to that one in June, July this year.
July 24th. That was a fun day, wasn't it, Mario?
July 24th. And since then, the police have visited me 4 times. They always ask me if I know when the next protest is on. I'm always like, I don't know. I'm not a mover and shaker here. I just turn up. Yeah. But looking around, I saw these people are from where I grew up. I grew up in the Bankstown area. Yeah. I was looking around. These the people from the outer suburbs who are dealing with this stuff. These are not. I'm an inner city elite now. But these are not the inner city elites. These are the people from out west. These are the people who've come from countries, and this goes back to an earlier point you made. They've come from countries and they've learned that governments can do bad things to you, and that there are bad things out there. They're not little Pollyannas running around saying, what a beautiful world, the sun's shining, the birds are chirping, everything's great. Like, they have come from countries where they have seen what governments are capable of. And they come here to Australia and suddenly they see governments saying, you can't leave your house, or you can't visit your family, and you have to take a vaccination. Or if they don't see governments do it, they see governments conniving with it. They see governments sort of winking at corporations, and they think, whoa, wait a second. This strongly reminds me of something that I've seen before. And they say to white Aussies like me, they'll say, guys, watch out. I know you think that nothing bad can happen, but I'm telling you that there is a world outside of the lucky country, and bad things happen. And I've seen this sort of thing before. And I think that's why we see so many people from those outer west, the immigrants, coming in to these protests. Although I'm happy to say I'm seeing a lot more sort of Anglo faces. Now people are going to take that soundbite and say Steve Chavura is a white supremacist.
No, you are, aren't you?
Well, by virtue of being white, clearly I am.
Oh, clearly, absolutely. They try to get me. This is a lot of people are like, Joel, why don't you thin out your eyebrows a bit? And I'm like, mate, these are the best defence against any of that. I had a recent hit piece done on me by the Sydney Morning Herald. They were trying to make all of us freedom fighters seem like we're all in it for the money and extremists, despite for the fact that this very same organisation has massive tax benefits, millions of dollars from the government. They come after us for a few thousand. And they basically wrote my resume, and they got the worst photo of me. I mean, I'm proud of the MAGA hat. I love it. I wear it with pride. But to an outsider that doesn't understand what it means to make your country great again and to revive the Anzac history, they're going to be like, oh, he's just a white nationalist. But what they can't remove is my eyebrows, and that's where they don't have me. But
that's right. I mean, that's actually significant, because it proves that this isn't just some racist movement. This is multiculturalism in a way. You know, when you go to these protests, that's multiculturalism.
If anything, it's the opposite, where we're complaining, why aren't there, 50% of the population's Anglo? It's like, where are they? That's the real question. And I'm not chastising them. I love all my Aussie Anzacs that come with their father's medals and everything, and they're proud. And you guys are absolute legends. But to make the argument that we're white nationalists, I mean, I wrote the barbecue bulletin. I put the suggestion in. I said, white nationalists are starting to wear blackface and stick on eyebrows to basically to these protests. And it was a photo of me, Rukshan, and Jerry.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah, it was good.
Three darkly. I'm not darkly coloured, but I've got thick eyebrows, and it was hilarious. But you're right. The values that we bring from the Middle East and from the countries that we come from. We don't like it. The experiences, like hands off our kids. We don't like what you're teaching. This dangerous gender ideology in school. We don't like what you're putting in their heads. But I'm conscious of time. But when it comes to the actual solutions, I think that, and we saw this in the 2019 election, greater education and letting these people know how to enact their democracy and what the manifestos of these parties are, what policies they want to get through is powerful. I mean, some people didn't know that the Labor Party manifesto for the 2019 election included hosting like the World Gay Pride Parade in Australia. Now, I've got plenty of gay friends, and Samrat, my friend, he's gay, and I fully support and respect his life choices. But a lot of people in these communities, especially these LGAs of concern, they've got problems with that. And these are historically Labor places that
very much so.
And you know what? This is what was said in a number of meetings. Some of these Muslim leaders, and I fully respect them for saying this, they sit down with the Labor MPs and they say, you care more about the rights of the gay community rather than our rights, our religious rights. What are you doing? And I'm not talking about some of the Muslim beliefs, guys. I'm talking about the freedom of speech, the freedom to practice in your own synagogue. And we're being locked down now, and in the last few years, and we just sort of gave it away. But greater education, greater knowledge, greater empowerment to let you know how to use your democracy. I think that's the way forward, but it's going to take time.
But also hitting the streets, and also being a pest at school meetings. I think one of the lessons we've learned from America is parents turning up to their school meetings and making trouble, and that doesn't mean being violent, but just being a pest. Asking questions that they don't want asked, drawing people's attention to aspects of the curriculum that education, the curriculum designers don't want parents in general to know about. Hitting the streets, protesting, making trouble in schools, and letting principals know that you're keeping an eye on them, and that sort of thing. And also, I think, not rewarding any political party that either actively imposes lockdowns or mandates, or basically tacitly goes along with them by not criticizing them. So not rewarding the right people politically, and not rewarding the wrong people. And I think that's actually very important as well. And as far as education goes, well, I mean, I'm an educator, so I'm all for education. And one of the things that actually makes me really optimistic about the future, and I mentioned this actually. Do you remember that book launch that we went to in the city? And John Howard was there even.
What was it?
It was the Cancel Culture book, edited by Kevin Donnelly.
The Left's Long March.
Yeah, the Left's Long March.
Yeah, it's the one with the fist, guys, the rainbow fist. That was
the rainbow fist, that's right.
It's a great,
Well, the last question that was asked, it was directed to me, and it was, Steve, are you hopeful for the future? Now, as I've said on other occasions, I'm sort of a pessimistic optimist. I actually do think things can get better, but I think they often have to get worse first. People need to be woken up. But one of the things that I see as incredibly exciting is social media, is the fact that a Jammal can put out a video and I see it gets 1 million hits. That is that we're in it. I think I even mentioned you at that event.
You did,
that Cauldron Pool can put things out and get 1 million hits. That other people out there as well, the Good Source and others can get hundreds of thousands of people watching their stuff, educating people, bypassing the traditional gatekeepers of the mainstream media, and basically being responsible for probably right now in Australia, in all the marches we've had, probably at least 1 million people hitting the streets all up. That's not because the mainstream media.
Yeah, don't say that too loud. We'll see the police again. But that's all right.
But I mean, so I'm actually quite hopeful about the future, because we no longer have to rely on the gatekeepers of the major newspapers, the major television channels to get messages out there. So, and I think the proof is in the pudding. I think that the recent protests have been a real positive sign of the future, and political parties do pay attention to that kind of thing. They really do. And so, yeah, I am hopeful. I mean, here's the thing, look, if I was completely cynical and hopeless, why would I even be sitting here? There'd be no point. And this is one thing, a warning that I want to give to people that watch guys like you and to a lesser extent watch guys like me. Don't become cynics. Like, be realists, like understand that there are a lot of problems in the system. There are a lot of problems in the major parties, that there's corruption and that kind of thing. Be realists, but don't be cynics, because because a cynic is basically someone who says it cannot be fixed because it is just too corrupt, there's no point doing anything. Well, I'm not interested in cynics. Cynics can take their cynicism elsewhere. I am interested in realists, and that's why when someone says, say the Liberal Party can never ever be fixed, my response to that is, well, you know something, hey, maybe that's true, but that's not helpful. That's not helpful to us, because it's never going away. It is always going to be there, and it's either going to be a force that's helpful or it's going to be a force that's detrimental. So for me, I prefer a realist approach, that right now it's very, very sick. Let's try and heal it, and in the meantime, let's look at some of these fantastic other freedom parties and independents in the meantime, and get them in there, and again for the long trip, see what we can do about the Liberal Party. But so get away from cynicism, get into realism, and that's the only way there's going to be any way forward. I mean, cynics are useless. And this is the other thing. What the forces against liberty want to do is either to, take a Dan Andrews. What does Dan Andrews want? Well, ideally what he would like is for all citizens to be his little fanboys, to bow down to him like you'd bow down to Nebuchadnezzar. That's what he would like. But he knows he's never going to get that. So what's the next best thing? The next best thing is to have most people, or a lot of people, love him, and the rest of the people to become utterly demoralized. And if you can't win them, then what leaders like Dan Andrews want is to demoralize people, because demoralized people, cynics, just don't care anymore. They don't try. And that is just as helpful to a Dan Andrews as a fanboy or a fangirl. And so we cannot lapse into cynicism. We cannot lapse into the system is hopelessly corrupt, we can't do anything with it anymore. That is just not helpful thinking.
I just say to them, stay home. I was like, let Gen Z and let the optimistic people and the realists.
The realists.
Solve not just blind optimism that we'd associate with naivety and young people. I mean, like people that actually are like, all right, look, I'm here for the long haul. I'm not going to run away to Florida. I'm going down with the ship. Let's try and solve this thing and plug the holes and bail some water out before this sinks. But,
that's right, and you're never going to plug all the holes, but you just want to keep it afloat, keep it floating in the right direction. And this is the thing, the optimist, the problem with being a hopeless optimist is that you're inevitably disappointed and you become a cynic. You want the realists, as you say.
100%. And so, I'm finding myself more recently I feel like I've got to tell a loved one that their other loved one has passed away. I'm like, guys, we need to be realistic about this upcoming election. This is what we're expecting, but this is why I'm always focusing on empowerment, education, and really helping you guys to have the tools to get the objectives done that you want to. is going to take time.
Yeah.
But Stephen, I'm forever grateful for you having the initial conversation with me in 2018. You're one of the first people that really helped me navigate this Australian politics, and we need more channels like yours. So everyone that's listening, you know, the link to Stephen is up in the description. I'll have him in the Shoreby link at the top. Please follow his Telegram, because that's where they can't censor him. He's only on 1,500 followers right now, but I know we can get it into the tens of thousands in the next few weeks. He's a wealth of knowledge, and yeah, if you guys are a business and you want to have conversations like this here, and you want us to give you a shout out, hit us up in the email there as well, and we'll get it out to you. But Stephen, I want to thank you so much for this conversation and coming out here.
It's always a pleasure, Joel. I really appreciate it. Thanks for your support, and thanks for everything you do. I think you're a national treasure.
Thank you so much. My pleasure. My pleasure.